The summer of 1971 was quiet in the small Spanish village of Belmez de la Moraleda, nestled in the hills of Jaén. Life moved slowly, with little more than the routine of farming and family life to occupy the villagers. But one day, everything changed. It began in the home of Maria Gomez Camara, a modest house with a cement floor in the kitchen. Maria had been preparing lunch when something peculiar caught her eye. On the cold, gray concrete beneath her feet, a faint shape began to take form. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a discoloration or a stain. But as the days passed, the shape grew more distinct. A face. Not just any face, it was human-like, with deep-set eyes that seemed to stare back at her, a mouth slightly open, as if caught mid-sentence, and features that were eerily lifelike. Maria, a devout Catholic, was terrified. She tried scrubbing the image away, but no amount of cleaning could erase it. Frustrated and unnerved, she called her husband and son for help. They decided to chip away the section of the concrete floor entirely, replacing it with fresh cement. For a brief time, life returned to normal. But just as the family began to relax, another face appeared in the exact same spot. Then another. Word of the phenomenon spread quickly through the village. Neighbors and friends came to see for themselves. Some were skeptical, dismissing the faces as nothing more than stains or tricks of the mind. But others were convinced that something supernatural was at play. The faces weren't just vague impressions, they had personality. Some appeared sad, others angry or pained. Maria's home soon became a hub of activity. Curious visitors traveled from neighboring towns to witness the so-called Blemez Faces. As the crowds grew, so did the faces. Over time, new ones emerged in different parts of the house. Each face was unique, as if capturing the essence of a different individual. The phenomenon caught the attention of paranormal investigators and scientists alike. A group of experts was called in to study the faces, hoping to uncover a rational explanation. Samples of the concrete were taken and analyzed, but the results were inconclusive. There was no evidence of paint or artificial pigmentation. Skeptics argued that the faces were a clever hoax, orchestrated by Maria and her family to attract attention. Some even suggested the use of chemicals to create the effect. But if it was a hoax, it was an elaborate one that would have required precise skill and a significant amount of time. And Maria, by all accounts, was a simple woman with no interest in fame or fortune. As investigators dug deeper, a chilling discovery was made. Beneath the house lay an ancient burial site. Human remains were found, dating back centuries. Could this explain the phenomenon? Were the faces the spirits of the dead, trying to make contact with the living? For decades, the mystery of the Blemez Faces remained unsolved. Scientists, skeptics, and paranormal enthusiasts debated the origins of the phenomenon, but no definitive answer was ever found. Maria Gomez Camara passed away in 2004, taking her secrets with her. Yet even after her death, the faces continued to appear, as if defying explanation. To this day, the Blemez Faces are one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in paranormal history. Whether a supernatural phenomenon, a clever hoax, or an unexplained quirk of nature, they continue to captivate the imaginations of all who hear their story. And so, the faces remain a silent testament to the unknown, etched into the concrete floor of a small house in a quiet Spanish village. Let's continue. The Mystery of the Blemez Faces, by Cryptiverse. Chapter 1, A Face in the Floor. It was the kind of day that Maria Gomez Camara had lived through 1,000 times before. The sun blazed high above the small Spanish village of Belmez de la Moraleda, bathing the rolling hills and cobblestone streets in golden light. Life here was quiet, predictable even. Maria spent her mornings tending to chores and her afternoons in the cool shade of her kitchen, preparing meals for her family. But this day, this ordinary day in August 1971, would mark the beginning of something extraordinary, something that would transform her life and her unassuming home into the focus of international intrigue. As Maria moved about her kitchen, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the evening meal, her foot brushed against something on the cement floor. She paused, her brow furrowing. There, etched faintly in the gray concrete, was a stain. At least, that's what it seemed at first glance. She knelt down for a closer look. The longer she stared, the more the stain seemed to take shape. It wasn't just a random smear of discoloration. No, this was deliberate. A face human-like, with deep, shadowed eyes and a mouth frozen in a strange, sorrowful expression. Maria recoiled, a chill racing down her spine. She called out to her husband, Juan, her voice trembling. When he arrived, she pointed to the floor, struggling to find the words to explain what she had seen. Juan squatted down beside her, his calloused hands tracing the edges of the image. It's just a stain, he said, trying to reassure her. Probably nothing. But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. That night, as the family sat down to dinner, Maria's eyes kept drifting back to the face on the floor. The dim light of the oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the room, and for a moment, she thought she saw the face move a trick of the light. Perhaps, or her own overactive imagination. The next morning, Maria decided to take action. Armed with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff-bristled brush, she scrubbed at the face until her arms ached. But no matter how hard she worked, the image refused to budge. Frustrated, she called Juan once again. This time, Juan brought a hammer and chisel. He chipped away the section of the floor where the face had appeared, replacing it with fresh concrete. For a time, the problem seemed solved. The face was gone, and Maria could breathe easy again. But her relief was short-lived. Just a week later, as Maria entered the kitchen to prepare breakfast, she froze in her tracks. There, in the same spot where the first face had appeared, was another. This one was different, more defined. Its eyes seemed to follow her as she moved, and its expression was one of pain anguish, even. Word spread quickly through the village. Neighbors began to gather at Maria's home, each eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious face. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers under their breath, while others whispered rumors of curses and restless spirits. Maria's kitchen had become the talk of Belmez de la Moralita. But the mystery was only beginning. Chapter 2, The Faces Multiply. In the weeks that followed the appearance of the second face, Maria Gomez Camara found her once quiet life turned upside down. Her kitchen, which had been her sanctuary, became a source of dread. The face refused to leave, and no amount of scrubbing or attempts to cover it could erase its presence. Worse, it wasn't alone. For long. One morning, as Maria entered the kitchen, she stopped cold. Beside the original face, another had appeared smaller, rounder, and even more detailed. The new face seemed to wear an expression of sadness, its mouth slightly downturned, its hollow eyes piercing. Maria screamed, drawing the attention of her husband and son. When they arrived, they stared in disbelief. It was undeniable now. The faces were real, and they were multiplying. News of the phenomenon began to spread beyond the village. Curious locals, skeptics, and the deeply religious came to Maria's home, drawn by whispers of a haunting. Some claimed the faces were signs from God, warnings of judgment. Others believed they were curses, left by restless spirits seeking peace. Maria felt the weight of their scrutiny and judgment. The villagers began to speculate wildly about her family's history and the land beneath her home. Rumors swirled that the property had once been a burial ground, though no one could confirm it. Feeling the pressure of the growing crowds and unable to bear the faces staring back at her, Maria once again called upon her husband. This time, the family resolved to take more drastic measures. They decided to dig beneath the faces, to see if the ground held any clues to the mysterious phenomenon. When the digging began, the villagers gathered outside, watching with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The sound of shovels scraping against dirt echoed through the quiet streets of Belmez. After hours of labor, Juan uncovered something chilling: human remains. Bones ancient and weathered were buried directly beneath the kitchen floor. Maria's heart sank. The discovery seemed to confirm the rumors. Her home had been built atop a grave. The family worked with the local authorities to remove the remains and give them a proper burial. Maria hoped that this act of respect would bring peace to the souls beneath her home and, perhaps, an end to the faces. But her hope was short-lived. Days after the bones were removed, new faces began to emerge. They appeared in different parts of the kitchen, their features more detailed and expressive than before. Some seemed to scream in silent agony, their mouths wide open. Others appeared serene, almost peaceful. Each face was unique, as if capturing the essence of a different individual. By now, Maria's home had become a sensation. Reporters and investigators from across Spain arrived to document the phenomenon. Photographs of the faces were published in newspapers, sparking debates about their origin. Some believed the faces were a hoax, created by Maria and her family to gain attention or financial benefit. But those who knew the family dismissed this idea. Maria had never sought fame, and the constant flow of visitors brought more stress than joy. Paranormal investigators were called in to study the faces. They conducted experiments, using everything from chemical tests to electromagnetic readings. The results were baffling. There was no evidence of paint or tampering. The faces seemed to emerge from within the cement itself, as if formed by some unknown force. For every explanation offered, more questions arose. If the faces were a natural phenomenon, why did they appear so detailed and expressive? If they were hoaxes, how had they been created without leaving a trace? And why did they keep appearing, even after the floor was replaced? Maria found herself at the center of a storm of speculation. The attention was overwhelming, but the faces continued to haunt her. No matter how many times the floor was replaced, they returned each time more vivid, more haunting. The phenomenon became known as the Blemez Faces, and Maria's home was declared one of the most mysterious places in the world. But as the years went on, the mystery only deepened. Chapter 3: The Eyes of the Unknown. The growing fame of the Blemez Faces brought a steady stream of visitors to Maria's home. At first, the attention was manageable, a few curious villagers peering in from the doorway, whispering nervously about the faces etched into the concrete floor. But soon, Maria's kitchen was flooded with reporters, scientists, and paranormal investigators, all eager to study the mysterious images. For Maria, it was as if her home no longer belonged to her. Strangers wandered freely, pointing at the faces, snapping photographs, and offering theories. Some swore the faces were divine signs, messages from the saints or the Virgin Mary. Others claimed they were demonic, a curse brought upon Maria for reasons unknown. Among the visitors was a local historian, intrigued by the discovery of human remains beneath the house. His research revealed that Belmez de la Moraleda had a dark and violent past. During the Spanish Civil War, countless lives had been lost, and many victims were buried in unmarked graves. Even before the war, the land was believed to have been a burial ground during the medieval period. These souls may not be at rest, the historian told Maria. The faces could be their way of reaching out, asking for peace. Maria was unconvinced. She wasn't a superstitious woman, but the constant appearances of new faces were wearing her down. Each time she walked into her kitchen, she felt their eyes on her. Even at night, when the house was quiet, she could feel their presence, as if the faces were watching her through the walls. One evening, as Maria lay in bed, she heard a faint sound coming from the kitchen. It was a low hum, almost imperceptible, like the murmur of distant voices. She clutched the rosary beneath her pillow and whispered a prayer. When morning came, she found another face on the floor, larger and more detailed than any before. This one was different. Its eyes were hollow, its expression frozen in a scream of terror. Maria's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. The villagers claimed the face was a bad omen. Some suggested performing an exorcism, while others insisted that Maria should leave the house entirely. But Maria refused to abandon her home. "This is my house," she said. "I won't let them drive me away." The arrival of the new face sparked renewed interest from the media. A team of researchers from Madrid visited the house to conduct a thorough investigation. They brought advanced equipment, including infrared cameras and chemical analyzers, hoping to uncover the truth behind the faces. The researchers tested the cement, searching for traces of paint or other substances that could explain the phenomenon. But the results were inconclusive. The faces appeared to be part of the cement itself, their pigmentation embedded deep within the material. One scientist proposed a theory: the faces were the result of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns, especially faces in random objects. According to this theory, the discolorations on the floor were natural, but Maria's mind had given them meaning, interpreting them as faces. But this explanation failed to satisfy the skeptics. The faces were too detailed, too lifelike, to be mere accidents. And what about the timing? How could natural stains appear so quickly, always in the same room? As the debate raged on, the faces continued to multiply. Some appeared faint, their features barely discernible. Others were vivid, almost as if they had been painted with a fine brush. Over time, the faces began to take on new expressions. Some looked calm, even serene. Others seemed to writhe in agony, their mouths twisted into silent screams. Maria began to keep a journal, documenting the appearances of each new face. She described their features in detail, noting their size, shape, and expression. She also recorded the strange phenomena that accompanied their appearances: the whispers in the night, the feeling of being watched, the inexplicable cold that sometimes filled the kitchen. Her entries grew darker as the years went on. January 3, 1972, another face today. It's smaller than the others, but its eyes are so lifelike. I can't bear to look at it for too long. I feel like it's staring back at me, judging me. What do they want from me? Why won't they leave me alone? February 15, 1972, I heard the voices again last night. They were louder this time. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded angry. When I went into the kitchen this morning, I found 3 new faces. One of them looks like a child. I feel like I'm losing my mind. As Maria struggled to maintain her sanity, the visitors kept coming. Some offered prayers, lighting candles in the kitchen and leaving small crosses on the floor. Others brought cameras, determined to capture proof of the supernatural. But no one could offer an explanation that satisfied Maria. The faces remained a mystery, a puzzle that no one could solve. Chapter 4, The Unseen Hand. As the Blemez Faces continued to appear, so too did a sense of unease that seemed to permeate the home. Maria began to notice strange occurrences, little things that seemed too coincidental to ignore. Objects would move when no one was around, chairs left slightly askew, cabinets left open. The air felt thicker in the kitchen, heavier, as if something was always hovering just outside her field of vision. One day, while cleaning the kitchen, Maria was startled by a sharp noise. She turned around quickly, expecting to see her husband or son, but no one was there. The noise had come from the far corner of the room, the same spot where the faces often appeared. As she cautiously approached the corner, she saw it: a new face, this one darker and more sinister than the others. It was as though the face was watching her, its hollow eyes following her movements. Maria's heart raced, and she backed away slowly, feeling a strange chill sweep through her body. Her husband, Juan, was becoming increasingly concerned. The faces, the strange occurrences, the unsettling feeling in the house, it was all taking a toll on his wife. He suggested they leave the house for a while, perhaps go stay with relatives in a nearby town. But Maria refused. She couldn't explain it, but something deep inside her told her that leaving would not bring peace. Instead, she sought out the help of a priest. Father Manuel, a respected figure in the village, had heard about the faces but had not yet visited the house. Maria invited him, desperate for any kind of answer. Father Manuel arrived one afternoon, his expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the faces on the floor. He knelt down and placed his hand over one of the images. A deep frown creased his forehead. "Do you feel anything?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. Father Manuel closed his eyes for a moment, as if deep in thought. Then he spoke, his voice calm but tinged with uncertainty. "I feel an energy, but it is not a peaceful one. This house, this place is troubled. I cannot say for certain what is causing the faces, but I believe that they are tied to something much older, something that cannot easily be dismissed." Maria listened intently, hoping for answers but fearing that Father Manuel's words would only add to the mystery. Father Manuel performed a blessing on the house, sprinkling holy water around the kitchen and reciting prayers in Latin. The atmosphere grew tense, and for a moment, Maria thought she saw the faces flicker, as though they were fading away. But when the prayer ended and the house grew quiet, the faces remained more vivid than ever. "I'm afraid," Father Manuel admitted, his voice heavy with resignation, "that there is little I can do. What we are dealing with here is not easily understood. I will continue to pray for you and your family, but I suggest you seek further counsel, perhaps from someone with experience in the paranormal." Maria felt a deep sense of frustration. She had hoped for a resolution, for some kind of explanation, but it seemed the answers were as elusive as ever. The next few weeks were quiet, too quiet. The faces stopped appearing, and the strange occurrences ceased. Maria began to wonder if perhaps the blessing had worked, if the spirits had finally found peace. She tried to return to normal life, preparing meals for her family and cleaning the house. But then, one evening in late spring, the faces reappeared, this time, with an intensity that took Maria's breath away. The first one appeared late at night. Maria had just finished cleaning the kitchen and was preparing to go to bed when she saw it, a face in the center of the floor, as if formed out of the very wood itself. This one was different. It was almost lifelike, the details so intricate that it seemed as though it were a living person staring up at her. Maria's hand trembled as she reached for a chair to steady herself. She knew, deep down, that this face was no ordinary apparition. It seemed to convey something urgent, almost pleading. The next morning, the faces multiplied. There were 3, each one in a different part of the kitchen. Each one appeared to be watching her, as if silently communicating with her. Maria was horrified, but at the same time, she couldn't bring herself to leave the house. She couldn't explain why, but she felt as though she were somehow connected to these faces, as if they were trying to tell her something. That afternoon, as Maria sat in the kitchen, she noticed something strange. The faces seemed to shift, subtly altering their expressions. The face that had once appeared to be pleading now seemed angry, its eyes narrowed, its mouth twisted into a scowl. Another face, which had been calm, now appeared frightened. Maria's mind raced. Could the faces be responding to something in her life? Were they trying to communicate with her, or were they simply manifestations of her own fears and anxieties? The next day, she reached out to a paranormal investigator named Jorge Luis, who had worked on similar cases throughout Spain. He agreed to visit the house and perform an extensive investigation. When Jorge arrived, he brought a team of specialists with him, experts in parapsychology, psychologists, and even a renowned medium. They set up cameras and began their examination of the kitchen. Jorge Luis began with a calm and methodical approach. He asked Maria about her family history, about any past experiences with strange occurrences or paranormal events. Maria recounted the strange happenings, the faces, the voices she had heard, and the growing sense of unease in her home. After hours of testing, Jorge finally sat down with Maria to discuss his findings. "We've seen some strange readings," he said, "but nothing that would explain the faces. There's no evidence of any external influence, no scientific explanation for what's happening. It's as though these faces are appearing from within the material itself." Maria's heart sank. "What does that mean?" Jorge looked at her gravely. "It means that whatever is happening here is beyond our understanding. These faces are not simply the result of some natural phenomenon. There is something more at play, something we can't see, something we can't touch. And I fear that it's tied to something dark, something buried beneath the house." Chapter 5: The Dark History Unfolds. As the weeks passed, the mystery surrounding the Blemez Faces only deepened. Maria's home had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking answers, scientists, religious figures, paranormal experts, and thrill seekers alike. Yet, despite the countless investigations and theories, no one could explain the origin of the faces. Some thought they were a hoax, others believed they were the result of some kind of unexplained phenomenon, but all were drawn to the idea that the faces were somehow tied to the land itself. Jorge Luis, the paranormal investigator, continued his research in the home, becoming more involved than he had initially anticipated. The faces, he concluded, were not simply an anomaly of nature or human perception, they were something more sinister. They were linked to the land beneath the house, which, as the local historian had discovered, had a dark and violent past. Maria had heard the rumors about the village's history, the tales of wars, killings, and betrayals. But it wasn't until Jorge shared his findings that the full scope of the past came into view. The land on which her house had been built had once been the site of brutal executions during the Spanish Civil War. Thousands of political prisoners, deemed enemies of the state, had been tortured and killed in the area. Their bodies were left in unmarked graves, their spirits restless, their lives forgotten by the passage of time. The faces, Jorge said, his voice low with concern, are likely the souls of those who perished here. They've been trapped in the land, their pain and suffering imprinted on the very earth itself. The images you see are their way of reaching out, trying to be remembered, to have their stories told. Maria listened in stunned silence. She had never imagined that the land her family had lived on for generations held such a dark history. It made sense in a way. How else could something so inexplicable take shape in her kitchen? But if the faces were indeed the spirits of the lost, why were they appearing now, decades after their deaths? What was it that had caused the faces to emerge at this particular time? Jorge theorized that the spiritual energy of the land had become restless once again, disturbed by an event or force. He speculated that the sudden surge of attention, the media, the visitors, the scientific investigations had somehow acted as a catalyst, awakening the spirits from their long slumber. Maria couldn't help but feel the weight of this revelation. It was one thing to live with an inexplicable phenomenon, it was another to realize that the very ground beneath her feet was the source of a great tragedy. She wondered if the faces were trying to communicate, if there was something they needed her to understand. Desperate for answers, Maria decided to dig deeper into the history of the land. She spent hours at the local archives, poring over old records and documents that had been stored away for decades. It wasn't until she uncovered a series of letters, written by a man named Antonio Martinez, that the mystery began to take shape. Antonio had been a prominent figure in the village during the Civil War. A member of a local militia, he had been directly involved in the executions of suspected enemies of the state. The letters, which had been written during the war, revealed a chilling account of the atrocities committed in the area. Antonio spoke of the people he had killed, men and women, fathers and sons, and the haunting memories that followed him. One particular letter stood out. In it, Antonio confessed that he had been forced to execute a group of innocent civilians who had been falsely accused of being spies. Their deaths weighed heavily on him, and he described hearing their voices in the night, calling out for justice. As he wrote, he seemed to grow more paranoid, fearing that the spirits of the victims would come to claim him. The final letter was dated just before the end of the war. In it, Antonio expressed his fear that the spirits of those he had killed were seeking vengeance. He spoke of the land itself becoming cursed, and of the faces that would one day appear, as if the souls of the dead were trapped in the earth, unable to rest. Maria's hands trembled as she read the letter. She realized that Antonio Martinez had been the last person to know the full extent of the suffering that had occurred on the land. His words confirmed what Jorge had suggested: the faces were the spirits of the victims, unable to find peace. But why had they waited so long to make themselves known? Why had the faces appeared in her kitchen, of all places? Maria couldn't help but feel a deep sense of guilt. She had always believed that the faces were a random occurrence, a strange and unsettling part of her life. But now she understood that they were part of a much larger story, one that had been buried for decades. Determined to understand the full truth, Maria returned to her home and began to study the faces with renewed focus. She had seen them change before, their expressions shifting from calm to angry, from peaceful to anguished. But now, as she stared at the floor, she noticed something new. The faces seemed to have begun interacting with one another. They weren't just isolated images, they were communicating, silently telling a story that had remained hidden for far too long. Over the next few days, the faces became more distinct. Some were old, others young. Some appeared to be soldiers, others civilians. One face, a young woman with sorrowful eyes, seemed to plead for help, as if trapped in a nightmare. Another, a man with a deep scar across his face, stared out with a look of bitterness and rage. Maria felt a deep sadness for the souls whose stories had been lost in time. She couldn't shake the feeling that the faces were trying to tell her something, that they had been waiting for someone to hear their stories. She sought out Father Manuel once again, hoping that he could provide some guidance. The priest listened carefully to her account of the faces, his expression grim. "I've been praying for you and your family," Father Manuel said softly. "But now, I believe you must do something more. You must acknowledge the spirits of the past, give them the recognition they deserve, and ask for their forgiveness." Maria knew that the only way to find peace was to confront the history of the land head-on. She decided to organize a memorial for the victims of the Civil War, a ceremony where the villagers could come together to honor the lives that had been lost and to acknowledge the pain that had been buried for so long. As the day of the memorial approached, Maria felt both anxious and hopeful. She had no idea whether the ceremony would bring an end to the faces, but she knew that it was the only way to move forward. The memorial ceremony was held under the setting sun, with villagers gathering in solemn silence around the makeshift altar set up in the garden of Maria's home. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective breath held by everyone present. Father Manuel led the service, his words resonating with a deep sense of reverence. He spoke of the souls lost to violence, of the innocent lives taken too soon, and of the need for reconciliation and peace. Maria stood in the background, watching as the faces in her kitchen slowly began to fade. She had never expected this moment to be so powerful, nor had she imagined that it would take such a personal toll. But with every prayer and every word spoken, the atmosphere in the house seemed to shift, the heavy presence lifting as though something ancient had been freed. As the last prayer was spoken, the villagers dispersed, their hearts filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. The faces, once so vivid, had begun to disappear. The kitchen, which had long been a place of dread, now seemed oddly quiet, as if the spirits that had haunted it were finally at rest. Maria stayed behind, her thoughts swirling with everything she had learned. The mystery of the Blemez Faces, once a source of fear, had transformed into a story of redemption. The past, dark and painful as it had been acknowledged, and with that acknowledgement came a sense of peace, a peace that she never thought possible. The following days were quiet. The kitchen remained clear of any strange occurrences, and the faces, though once so vivid, had faded into the shadows of memory. The land, no longer cursed, had found a kind of closure, and so, too, had Maria. She never forgot the faces that had appeared on her kitchen floor, the souls that had sought recognition for so long. But as time passed, their images grew less frequent in her mind, and the house, once a place of fear and mystery, became a home again. And so, the story of the Blemez Faces became a legend, a tale of tragedy and redemption, whispered among the villagers of Belmez. For Maria, it was a chapter in her life that she would carry with her forever, a reminder that the past, though painful, could be healed when faced with courage and compassion. As for the Blemez Faces, they faded into history, leaving behind only their fleeting images in the minds of those who had witnessed them, their stories told at last. And with that, the mystery was resolved, leaving behind not fear, but a profound understanding of the deep connection between the living and the dead. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Spain's most enduring mysteries. The Blemez Faces continue to fascinate, but their story now rests in the hands of those who dared to seek answers. And while the faces may be gone, their legacy of grief, redemption, and understanding remains forever.